Late for that, Joe. There's been so many incidences. If you remember, I take you back to Charlottesville, and that was really considered a crucial moment for choosing in the Republican Party. And you had so many who chose to say nothing, because what happened was they made a bargain. They made a bargain that they needed to get this tax cut bill done, that this was the end-all and be-all to save this party in the midterm elections. And now, as you're seeing with this Pennsylvania race as the first test case, they themselves acknowledged by pulling back in the advertising that it was not going to save them, that this was not a winning message with those middle-class voters. So, yes, you may see some Republicans continue to be critical and maybe amp up their criticism, folks like Ben Sasse, but I don't know how many new defectors you're going to see, because they cut that deal a while ago.
Right. When President Trump visited the Pennsylvania 18 district on Saturday night, he talked at length about the tariffs that he had just imposed on steel, but he barely mentioned his signature tax cut legislation. Steve Ratner says that was likely by design. And Steve, you have charts to explain why.
So Heidi gave me a great lead into this point of why the tax cut hasn't resonated. So first, let's start with the facts and take a look at what actually has happened. If you look at the ads that were being run by Saccone and his various affiliated groups, the RSCC and so forth,
wow,
you can see that when you go into mid-February, early February really, about 67% of all the ads that were run in that district mentioned the tax cuts as a reason to vote for the Republican. And then that went off a cliff. And by the time you got to last week, there were actually zero mentions of the tax cut.
Can you believe that? Okay, so again, for people that have never been into political campaigns before, you save your best for last. It's like a case in the courtroom. You save your best for your closing argument, and that last week is your closing argument. And Steve, I mean, it got to be demoralizing for Paul Ryan and the rest of Congress and Donald Trump and everybody who thought that these tax cuts were going to be their salvation, political salvation, that they didn't even mention it. And they didn't mention it for good reason.
Well, it wasn't working, and part of what, how you can see that is in the public polling, where the tax cuts were hugely unpopular when they were passed, and then they gradually got more and more popular. They never achieved a plurality or majority popularity, but they got more and more popular. And then right about the time these ads started to turn, they went the other way. And now the tax cuts by about there was a Quinnipiac poll, I think 50% unpopular, 39% popular. So if you think Republicans think that is their best calling card, they're in for an awakening.
You know, it's interesting on that, as we're looking at these numbers, it's interesting that Democrats were concerned when Nancy Pelosi talked about the tax cuts just giving crumbs to the other 99%. And then a poll came out from a pro-Trump group that actually showed that a plurality of Americans agreed with Nancy Pelosi, that these tax cuts were, yeah, and it certainly... How much money did Warren Buffett say these tax cuts made for him? I mean, just billions. I mean, maybe billions of dollars. Donald Trump,
for his company, it was half of his profits last year.
Half of his profits last year. One of the richest men in the world. Donald Trump goes down to Mar-a-Lago right after the tax cuts pass, and he brags to all of his billionaire friends. He said, "I just made you guys a lot of money." And Americans obviously agree with that.
Well, and in fact, data is starting to come out that confirms that point of view. So, for example, the Treasury claimed that 70% of the benefits from the tax cuts were going to go to average Americans, that they would filter through. The business tax cuts would filter through to workers. And in fact, you're now seeing data that shows that that's not true. So this is a Morgan Stanley research study. 43% of the business tax cuts are going to share buybacks and dividends,
and by the way,
not
Steve,
to workers.
We all said that around this table, that most of the money is going to go to stock buybacks.
19% to M&A, 8% to pay down debt, and wage increases over here 13.2% compared to the 70% that Treasury was claiming. And then to your point about about Nancy Pelosi, about their crumbs being left over, let's take a look at what is in fact left over for the average American out of the whole pie. So if you look at those business tax cuts I was just talking about, 31%, people making more than $75,000 a year, 54%, and so for the average American, 16%, And so for someone making a typical wage of about $58,000 or $60,000, that's $950 a year. That's what they're getting out of this $1.2 trillion